Hello everyone, today we talk about Celtic missionaries, a topic that we have rarely addressed and that is framed in the broader one of the Christianization of Europe and so missionaries and barbaricum as we could address. I don't use this terminology by chance. Here there is properly a problem that makes in fact the Celtic missions more fascinating, because we're talking about areas that had been fundamentally not Romanized, right? Today we'll talk much about Ireland specifically, as you understand, that was notoriously not a land, at least directly controlled by the Romans. Of course, there was extensive exchange where there was possibly also a Roman presence, because also the Gaelic chieftains were often allies with the Romans. The Romans intervened. Gaelic chieftains went sometimes in exile in Roman Britain and so on. So there had been a dialogue. There had been fundamentally an intense contact at many levels. Albeit naturally, Celtic society, especially in Ireland, had not been fundamentally modified by Romanization. Yet it notoriously saw the expansion of Christianity from a relatively early age, right? And in modalities that eventually founded the Irish Church, the foundations, the organization of the Irish Church, the Insular model, right? It was in part actually tried to be brought in Britain, because naturally Britain, was being Christianized in the process as well. But even in there was first of all, a relatively different situation, but also, the passage from Brittonic, Romano-Briton to Anglo-Saxon times, let's say, was pretty harsh. There were also certain, there was a non-linear process. There were certain setbacks, and the Gaelic world was, in the sense, the cradle of a new system. For a while also was to take over the Anglo-Saxon church organization, and that eventually from the 6th century was reshaped according to the Roman model, notably because Britain had been Romanized, had been urbanized. So the system of the dioceses was in place, right? Especially in the south, in the areas where especially the cities had declined the least, and by, Britain had Roman civilization in Britain, evaporated more quickly than in other provinces of the empire, but still the remains were strong in a way. So, but also especially in early medieval times, we know that the insular missions, the Gaelic missionaries, would essentially spread the gospel in places like Gaul, even like Italy, northern Italy especially, and Germany. This process took a long time. It was gradual, went at different waves, and was also connected, especially in later times, with the Carolingian expansion in the process of evangelization of the Central European peoples. In these earlier times, was connected to the mostly the Christianization of the Frankish and the Lombard kingdom, right? Also very important monastic foundations. Think about Saint Columba in France or northern Italy and so on. And what we'll see today, very briefly, is essentially the cultural background, or the mindset background, if we can reconstruct it in part, which is up to some point impossible, from which these missions stemmed, and what were the dialectic that was used to convert these areas of Europe that, as you understand, were the hardest stock of paganism actually was. Like, look at Ireland itself. So areas of Europe where sometimes, in fact, Romanization had not arrived. Christianization also took a long time, and chiefly also thanks to these missions, would prevail. So we have made a lot a bit at this point about the Christianization of Europe, so I don't readdress other topics that you can find elsewhere. There's a medieval Christianity playlist. If you're interested, you can just go there and check. So it's evident that, first of all, the conditions of early medieval times here pose an important challenge. Since there is probably the collapse of a state, right? The Roman Empire was, fundamentally a Christian empire. So aside from the very gradual process of conversion that happened, but it's not even about the conversion itself, but as we've seen from a cultural point of view, probably it was just deciding of Christian beliefs to pagan ones, right? The latter disappearing over a period that it can be properly calculated, right? Because there were certain beliefs also that were all an hybrid with Christian ones that lived up to very recent times in many areas of fully modernized Europe. Maybe we can see it in France, you can see it in, it's fundamentally normal that such approach would take place, especially from a world that had not known anything else but the pagan mindset that accepted the potentially the use proper of any kind of deity as long as it made things work, right? Naturally, Christianity posed another problem, was more less tolerant, of course, way less tolerant in this sense, but it also there are very interesting, especially there are certain sagas, etc., that document, by the way, the autonomous Christianization of most of the north of Europe, for example, that show how paganism at a certain point realized that objectively Christianity had some advantages that the previous religions didn't have, right? It's also the reason why fundamentally they embraced it. So we have countlessly described how gradual and also how usually non-violent this conversion was, in the sense that aside from the obvious impositions that essentially from a political more than from an ecclesiastical, but obviously the thing went together at the time, it was all a matter of elites, right? The true clash and most of the violence was enforced was something pertaining to levels of society where the interests at stake were quite high, and that weren't properly based on religion but on the momentary political balance that the conversion found, right? Because it was usually the most powerful was, more open to the idea that, more capable, first of all, to impose its own authority, and to look at the Christian, or if anything, diocesan organization that was a territorialized one, powerful, bureaucratized with certain specific centers that could help to centralize government and so on. It's not that the other side championed paganism because they were actually or necessarily more or less open to Christianity than the other side, but just because they were the ones that were brought under at the moment by that guy that most of the times also kept being a pagan in spite of conversion and so on. But once again, this goes aside, and it's a wholly different matter. Today we don't even see that. Today we see properly this first moment in which Europe was devoid of a state. We have seen it many times then. The Romano-Germanic kingdoms, and here we're talking even of beyond this dimension in Celtic Ireland, as in other areas, by the way, of Europe, were completely devoid also of even just of the fundamentals of the realization of what the public in practice had previously been, right? All these populations also of Celtic origins, think about, from Gaul, Britain, northern Spain, northern Italy, all the Danubian area, had been subdued, violently also by the Romans. The elites had Romanized and allowed this to happen too, in the same ways through which the process of Christianization eventually happened afterwards. But most of the countryside actually remained, outside of this, right? The same Romans as later the church didn't quite care about them, right? And also there are instances of revolt. Think about the Bagaudae, or other, these other pirates, more the Gaelic world was quite active in this. We've seen it. We've made some videos on the Gaelic warriors mentality, and obviously took just the chance, like the Vikings. People think there's deep, I don't know, cultural, ideological reasons for these invasions. This is what always happens every time an empire crumbles, and the motivations were overwhelmingly looting, as these peoples had for the first time the chance of doing that instead of raiding their much poorer areas that would bring to also this dramatic lifestyle sometimes, where they couldn't support locally enough people, so that they had to fight properly for that. This is just a broader picture. But it's obvious that the absence of a state brought an extreme difficulty and slowness, let's say, in this, let's call it, process of cultural transformation. This is evident sometimes even in the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, right? Think about the problem of Arianism, how much it took for certain realities to fully abandon the idea that, after all, there was another way of believing, of Christ, in Christ, and in its attributes, and in the ways these cultures had felt previously. Arian, most of the times, even here, doesn't mean specifically much about the actual theological understanding of Christianity. It was dramatically low. Anyway, most of what we see as Arian peoples, namely, were actually pagan, right? A very few of them were namely Christian, and it's just the sedentarization in the Romano-Catholic areas that would bring, a bit like for the, like in the East, to the simple absorption of these elements in the overwhelming, numerically speaking, amount of the population in post-Roman Europe, and that were overwhelmingly Catholic, right? At least for what, and this was always happening in the cities, so that's why bishops and the conversion in this regard happened relatively, at least in these areas, actually relatively quickly compared to the fringes of Europe, the non-Roman Europe. But in fact, it was a matter of elites that lived in the cities, and as far as the countryside was concerned, the conversion was more difficult, and even in here, in different areas of Europe, carried out in different ways, different times. Right, it's obvious that regions like, I don't know, Italy was much more easily Christianized than Britain, right, or eventually Germany. I mean, it was simply, it's not just a matter of predisposition to certain ideas per se. It's properly a socio-economical problem. That is to say, how, what are these societies about, right? And it's obvious that the Mediterranean was simply more open, more fertile in many ways to all the expansion of these more complex systems and their functionality to a fundamentally more developed society. This is also the broader pattern in which we should read this process. There is another aspect that is fundamentally a breaking, curbing factor, represented by the influence of all this based so-called barbaricum, right, that extended itself outside the Romanized lands of the West. So, as we can see geographically, in the north and in the east of it. So we're talking about the same British Isles, naturally, or in great part, at least, because, as we've seen, Britain also was, lost quickly, more than other provinces of the empire. Important characters of Romanization. It even changed language, right? Britain was basically the only land of the former Roman Empire where people began to speak a language was part of another branch compared to the previously, the previous tongue in post-Roman Europe, or at least, as far as the West is concerned. And the East is more messed up in some ways. There are the Slavs as well. That's another story. But today we talk about this, and not only because we're talking about Germany, naturally, Central Eastern Europe, the Avars, the Slavs, right? And also in these regions, however, the missionary action was developing with substantial progress, after all. After having began relatively early, right, since the 5th century, the directioning of the local non-Christian populations had been impacted by this. As we were saying before, Christianity was spreading on its own. Ireland is the most evident case, right? Nobody imposed it there. Also, it would largely happen in other areas of Northern and Eastern Europe just centuries and centuries later. And in the same Ireland, of course, the thing would take a very long time. But these roots were seeded relatively early. Ireland did participate to even the conciliar disputes in the West. There were also heresies. Actually, think about Pelagianism. Saint Pelagius, that was I don't remember. He was a Celt. Actually, he came from the British Isles. He participated to spread also this vision of the world. So there was a discourse. There was a contact. Right. One thing I think it's very useful to point out every time we talk about Roman and non-Roman world historically is that this difference is very loose. Right, we have a very kind of 19th century national statal, prejudice about what is like the boundaries between this area. The world was open, was dramatically open. People traveled as, ideas especially traveled as crazy, and context had always been there, and there is not this intrinsic conflictuality until you don't bring an actual pressure that you, however, have to have the means of imposing. For the rest, Christianity here spreads autonomously, which evidently shows that a part of this world was not only open to these ideas, but also, felt, they had an option. They had a free option. They accepted one. They decided that was more fitting for them. And in order to render an idea of the difficulties that the Christianization, the missionary activity especially, meant, we just remember, for example, an episode about the life of Saint Patrick that was written in the 7th century by the Irish Murku, right? So 2 centuries after, fundamentally, the preaching of Patrick. So Patrick is represented in action in Tara, that, as you know, was the sacred capital of pagan Ireland, right? It was also, and not surprising in this sense, the seat of its kings that were also provided with this complex sacred character, and the physiognomy of which reveals very old Indo-European roots. So this naturally, the same pagan background of Ireland, in part, favored probably the reflection around the concept of sacrality of this. What this was evidently a politically imposing problem in itself, right? And this is fascinating because other areas of Europe had, of pagan Europe had something similar, but also difficultly something so deeply centered in a single settlement. But aside from this, the description of facts from the side of Murku is attempted, spot on, and reveals more or less voluntarily the strength of the pagan beliefs fabric that the missionary here had to unhinge. within which also appears evident the persistence of ancient sacred taboos, the gessa in the Chronicle, that fundamentally enveloped the Irish sovereignty in a series of protective prohibitions. This was a way, naturally, you know that even in the pagan world, people presumed that the pagan world was free in the sense that, it's like, the monotheistic empires as the Nazis of the situations, and these were instead the hippies of the situation. It was concretely and nothing like that, right? The religion in the pagan world was extremely strict as far as properly the social, consequently political regulations were concerned, right? Since these were stateless societies, the same communities had to deal with that by stressing the ideological side of the limitation in order to discipline their own aristocracies, right? To usually not overstep, right? So tendentially, this was by not confirming kings, but avoiding, that kings would rise in the first place, but also the presence of kings also limiting their action, right? This was also the case. So even if you see here a sort of rule, right, a sort of precepts that, after all, religions usually share. Religions proper, after all, because that is properly, even etymological, the social value of what religion is to create a cohesion, right, within the boundaries of certain rules. So the hagiographer tells, for example, that when the king Loegar moved, quote, the men and the horses kept their head turned towards the left as he was pleased. That is, he's informing us that respecting specifically a taboo, they couldn't look at the sovereign. This is imposant, right? It's rare to find something like, of course, this is Christian hagiography, so he's probably telling us something that probably didn't quite work the same way, because now maybe we can't fully explain the whole thing, it would take a long time, but the concept here is that the source is depicting a sort of tyrannic picture of what these kings were fundamentally. Of course, there were limitations. This guy was mighty, and surely there was a specific etiquette that regulated relations with his retinues and so on, but the situation was way less dramatic and hierarchic as probably sounds, right? Indeed, was a very violent character attached to it, though, and more of this later. So this, harsh nature of authority, after all, is concrete. And there is no other way of making it, by the way, not even in the civil war, but on the contrary, this betrays rather the fact that these societies didn't have many other means to control, but concentrating mostly on this heroic, aristocratic, kingly, and divine, or sacred, better, nature of power. Right, and that's therefore the admission that, of course, that there weren't many other means to make the others accepted, because that Ireland in practice was a freaking mess, right? So this kingship was of relative power. There were so many other noble, and it was a dramatically unstable situation. So in Tara, Patrick, that's where the violence counts, properly challenges Druids with a magic duel. The Druids were these important figures in the Celtic society that weren't just, we mostly see them as the priests of the situation, but they're something more complex, right? Properly in this world was was of course about certain individuals that to officiate certain ritual and sacrifices, etc. But their figures was way more dynamic. It was probably a Druidic teaching that mostly pertained to the elites as well. So nothing really changes much from pagan to Christian after all, because they are always the elites that are managing this. That entails a deep education. We know Druids had a consistent understanding of of knowledge that of course was overwhelmingly non-scientific, but other things were for the time not normal, but in ways scientific, in way that naturally we have to, that amazes us for the times considered, but that are also fairly common also worldwide in most cultures. And about astronomy, about hence geometry, mathematics, but even substances, this broader naturalistic understanding, etc. But that's the cool kind of scientific side of the story. But the Druids were fundamentally also warriors, noblemen. They weren't actually very different from the rest in this regard. And it was, in fact, specifically this education was provided took years to fulfill. Actually, this is not even just a specifically Celtic thing, right? When we start talking about the Celtic fringe in the British Isles, we are seeing naturally a world that historically had this point literally being cut out by the rest, right, of the Celtic world. Just maybe a certain area like Britannia, or northern Spain had remaining part, properly Celtic in nature, but now this were confined ever more towards this northwestern corner, while the Germans basically pushed. But they properly this wasn't a specifically Celtic thing, because it wasn't anything like a proper a boundary of Celtic culture as such. It's very, if not impossible. Also, we Celticists have studied this extensively, and it turns out that even these were in many ways the same peoples, but there are very few similarities, for example, from a religious point of view, between the Insular Celts and the Gaelic deities, right? These were words that were very, very local in many ways. And of course, they're unfortunately grossly underdocumented, but we also know by how the extension of their political and social structures that more or less their horizons were relatively, their beliefs, their cults were importantly also locally located, right? After all these shrines and sanctuaries that will, all this Gaelic spirituality that will flow in fact into Irish Christianity and beyond, is what emerged from a very crude background. Like, most of the divinities were basically deified champions, heroes. Like, also this tumuli, these tombs underground where, people went to, because they assumed that the warrior had been so great that they could, that this power they had was divine. So by getting literally close to it, it was also a very contractualistic, even physical, emanatistic thing, right? Yeah, let's go praying, bringing offers and so on. We will get this force back. We'll get an advice. These are things that happen all over the world, right? Nothing essentially different in such. It was a militarized society, and this these burials, these places of worship, were eventually expanding, becoming temples, and also much of the geography of early medieval Europe actually stems sometimes from individuals that eventually were sanctified because of appeasing the local communities, but were nothing but these ancient pagan warriors that preached, of course, a very few in terms of Christian precepts. So this is all an important process, but the centrality of the champion, right, in the Celtic fringe was very important, because that the least stratified society is, like the more primitive also society is, the more it tends, militarily speaking, towards the heroic culture. Right, heroic culture is not a symptom of a dramatic military advancement, quite the contrary. It's like one of the most primitive forms from which eventually more complex systems expand. So that betrays also this, as Gaelic policy dramatically shows, this dramatic fragmentation, right? And which the warrior, the champion, the clan leader had still this enormous responsibility, because he was basically the only authority there, right? All these kings were recognized, broadly, more or less, because of political interest and so on, but their effective power was fairly, pretty limited, to say the least. The thing, therefore, is that what Patrick does in the geography is that he challenges properly the Druids in a magical duel. Now, we'll see now better what this means. The Druids were surrounding King Loigar, right? They were part of his entourage, of his retinue. They were part of this aristocratic elite of Tara, so they were some of the most prestigious pagan authorities, right? And naturally, in the geography, Patrick wins against this wise man. And the pattern of the duel, geographically speaking, is not anew, right? It's not typical of this context. It's to be found in the resolution, for example, of the controversies between Catholics and heretics. I don't know, for example, in 588, this duel is to be found at the Visigothic court of Recared, according to the history of Gregory of Tours. The duel went to the disfavor of the Arians, the bitter clashes that exactly at the end, in fact, of the 6th century were happening between Catholics and Arians in Visigothic Spain because of exquisitely political reasons. Right? And 1 century later, famously, in a battle between Longobards in northern Italy, there was the rightful and Catholic King Cunibert that challenged to single combat the rebel Duke Alahis, that was an Arian, and naturally Alahis is defeated together with his whole army, right? And this is also, by the way, more intertwined with more specific ecclesiastical or better papal policy at that point, because it was much of Arianism in itself. Alahis represented this hard stock of alleged Longobard pagan traditionalism, but things probably went otherwise. The problem there was the so-called Tricapitoline Schism. That was one problem that now we can't digress on, but had engulfed Italy and the relations between the Longobards, the Longobard kingdom, and the papacy in the south. But in fact, these were the latter are examples of theological disputes in which the Catholic side had the upper hand. In Ireland, it's different because it's, as we've seen, out of the boundaries of the old Roman world, and the clash is played, let's say, with the arms of the masters of the place, right? That is, with magical weapons. You may think it's not so different after all, because it's still kind of, you think, divine or, it's still magical in a way, you would think. Well, but it's deeply different, because in here we see properly the root. In there we're talking about Christians that, are already, peoples are already Christianized fundamentally within a specific dialectic of the local, institutions, etc. Mostly of Roman legacy, and it's clear to see fundamentally a pattern that stays within the boundaries of Christian theology. Here instead, we are at the spring of paganism, right? A very different world. Patrick, while one of the Druids at the presence of the king denigrated Catholic faith, having invoked the Lord, he lifted him in the sky, pronouncing these words. I'm quoting, the magician was lifted in the air, and eventually from the above he was left to fall head down on a rock, and he died smashed under their eyes, for which the pagans were caught by fear. Now, this is fascinating, isn't it? Because what does Patrick do here? Do you think it's a very Christian thing? He actually, here it's technically God that takes the guy and smashes his freaking brains over a rock, right? But if you read it from an Irish, but from a Gaelic point of view, what happens here is that naturally it's a magic thing. Patrick was born, we could say, in the same mindset. Takes this guy and freaking kills him, right, with superpowers. This is something you don't find in the other context. Of course, there is actually a lot of borderline hybrid of this, in a geography, right? But normally a geography was written by people that had, a bit more of a, kind of, in fact, Catholic and Romanized background. The Celtic Insular Christianity for a long time maintained, after all, mindset was dramatically close to these worms. But it's not even a matter of what they believed, what probably the geographer Moirco might have believed proper, but it was rather what a geography said to be showed to the pagans that read this stuff. Because let's be honest about this, that one of the most problematic aspects of conversion was to make understand these people that were living in essentially militarized society, or a warlike society, whatever, which war and killing and enslaving and exterminating was, normal by any standard. A pacific religion could be about. Now, as you know, we have talked a lot about how, Christianity is full, of course, of properly, not just violent, but properly military content. The Bible is one of the most important sources in military history, I would say. But aside from this, of course, the word contents could be drawn from the Bible that were extremely violent, could reinforce properly a militaristic ideology. Think about the Carolingians, right? The Carolingians, as we've seen, are all about the Old Testament. They're more Jewish than Christian in their institutional vision, and in the relation properly of the empire with God, right? It's just the Ottonians that gradually transition to something more acceptable by Catholic standards. What we see here is that, as far as these guys might have seen, the Druid was killed in a duel. As duels, were literal here, not simply magical, right? Patrick could not evidently be presented as a warrior champion, right? But we don't have to go that far to presume that there was something about this story that could conceal maybe even a siding of certain champions to Christianity and to challenge at this courtly level even the Druidic champions, and to literally split their head open, as it happened here. Who knows? Maybe the geography stemmed from a con. I'm simply inventing that. Where there was had been an actual duel. Maybe the pagan, or at least even the Christians used pagan champions because those were mercenaries. They could be easily paid in that regard. But let's say that Loigar Druid might have simply slipped, trying to, and broke his freaking head on a rock, falling, right? And that's how the story might have occurred. But we really have to think from the very material and violent side of this story, because that's, after all, what a pagan would believe in. What is forgiveness in a world where the most important thing is to be a great warrior? Right? It doesn't make sense. Albeit, Christianity in this sense that does not explicitly forbid violence. It simply says that you should evaluate fundamentally better what's the better option. And even in the pagan world, and we find it even in the Celtic, but also in the Germanic context, but in everyone, that the king proper was not usually the young, hot-headed warrior that had all to prove and to go in battle berserk-like. Think about the Gaelic Fiannas who made videos about that. They were all about that freaking fury and impetus, right? Kings were usually kind of middle-aged men that were still warriors, because of course they would remain essentially till death, as even just medieval knights would remain. We know of people that went to make tournament in their 80s, right? Still by the 13th century and so on. It was normal. These people spent their life fighting. There was no other, I would like to stress, there was no other option, right? It's not they had to decide it or not. That's why also monks here were so alternative from the Christian point of view, because they make them realize, after all, that the chieftain, yes, as we've seen, was also warrior technically, but also, if anything, for biological reasons and experience, was also had to be fundamentally wise, right? So he didn't have just to cut in half every person who find himself that disagreed with in front of him, but to wonder how he could use his means in a more intelligent way. And after all, the Christian model presented this idea, for example, with the foundations, right? The spread of private foundations that could be sacred, like the monasteries, couldn't be touched. There was all a patrimonial interest behind it. This is overwhelmingly documented, especially in Carolingian and post-Carolingian Europe, where especially now that landed property was, way more extensive in the sense that than Ireland would ever have for, most up to the low Middle Ages. But even from there, we know that every small king of Ireland, as much as this could be an Anglo-Saxon king as well, and objectively there weren't dramatic differences. Think about Scotland as well. Would have their own tiny foundation, their tiny shrines, tiny monastery, right? That they would invest in as an asset, right? And we noticed the thing spread, also considering that initially there was no diocese system. I mean, I presume you know it pretty well, that difference is what we were talking about before between the Insular and Roman model, where the absence of or better, let's say the overlapping of the diocese with the monastery. Why? Because Ireland had no city. So they didn't have to anywhere else to centralize, but in the monasteries that were in the countryside, because the whole island was a countryside. Not like Britain, for example, at least in the Romanized part, had, after all, its own city with its own diocese. And where, in fact, the Roman model, the Insular model, for a moment had prevailed also among the Anglo-Saxons. Eventually, especially the Gregorian missions, the thing gets Roman once again. But in Ireland, that was the point. The abbot fundamentally is also the bishop. But the context in which the missionaries in the Barbaricum land had to step, as you understand from St. Patrick example, is difficult, because it's essentially a violent war. Ask what happened to Boniface when he went among the Frisians. Now, Patrick was surely not obliged to lift his own rival, but his action had to be presented geographically, as we were saying before, in propaganda terms, and in this specific propaganda terms, in order to be adapted to the cultural coordinates of its potential public. Right? The message of the duel that we have described before is that Patrick was fundamentally a more powerful magician than the Druids, that, by the way, were implicitly also recognized as such. This is the interesting aspect of the story. We'll see it even as far as Gregory the Great is concerned in the same Italy, that is properly the recognition that, after all, these wizards and their power did exist. As we were saying before, yeah, okay, these were Christians, but they had come from, it was normal to believe that spirit forces existed out there, that it was a world all to sort out, and this is what even much later, when our non-Christian beliefs abandoned in European culture and folklore. Ask the Grimm brothers. I mean, we all have. Even in the most, historically most deeply and early Christianized countries, we all know stories that are grotesquely, maybe they're mediated surely by Christianity. Think about lycanthropy, for example. That is something that was definitely connected to these ancient, also animal cultural practices, warrior practices. They survive. And it's not so unfrequent for people to even believe in that, right? Aside from neo-paganism, now is coming back and seemingly, let's skip on the average quality of of the alleged recovery of the past. But most of the times it's just a plain insult to pagans, to real pagans, because people just are blatantly losing discipline and structure. That's why such things are coming back. It's not because we properly understand and respect what our pagan past has been in this regard, as much as the Christian past has been in this regard. But aside from that, it's obvious that, without forcing too much the parallelism, that even towards the, let's say, rural classes of the old Roman world, the things could not be represented in a very radically different way, right? As we were saying, these people were believing in monsters, in other forces. A geography is essentially designed not to debunk it, but to tame it. That is to say, the saint. We have seen it also in a bit of those videos on the rise of chivalry, and also the ideology behind it. That the Christian saint, by crushing these creatures, is not eliminating them from the memory of the people, because otherwise they would have not even inserted in the geography, right? The myth that Christianity destroyed everything that existed is, banally speaking, you have never read a geography if you think anything like that, because a geography is a declaration that not only that these things were there, but that they were pretty damn powerful. And what happens really is that the saint doesn't destroy them, but absorbs them, right? This is the real Christianity that Europe has grown from, right? It's not a totalitarian regime. It's a work of civilization, which is a very different thing, if you allow me to point that out. And there is an example exactly from the ideology of Gregory the Great, that notoriously was also responsible for the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, and it was in very strong contact, in fact, with the British Isles and also with the Celtic missionaries. The ideology are written in 593-594. Now, Gregory was notoriously he was a perfectly senatorial and eventually episcopal sample, let's say. Dramatically skilled, educated, a jurist. He had worked in the Roman administration. Rome was still a pretty large city at the time. And eventually bishop. An excellent career, right? bishops are basically the senators of the path. They're literally the same people, right? They're the same, very same families, especially in the case of Gregory, that was part of probably of the Anici, that were some of the most powerful families in the late Roman Empire. And we made a video on specifically on this topic, that is the one of Saint Aquitsius, that is from almost 1 year ago, if I'm not wrong, that explains exactly how Gregory coped with not the urban elites, right, with whom there was an agreement now, at least the Italian peninsula, independently from whether it was ruled by the Byzantines or the Longobards, because this is the moment in which it had begun. They were Christian. The Longobards were Arian, right? They were a problem, but and also enemies of the papacy up to the early 7th century, namely at least. And, or better, intrinsically conflictual with them, but not even enemies proper. Had to now proceed. He bought himself with, and this was a great cultural work, to start converting the countryside. Why? Because at this time, Italy had been raised by the Gothic War, by the Byzantine reconquest specifically. If it had depended on the Goths, Italy would have remained fully, late antique for a much longer time. Now, the Gothic War, the Justinian plague that, as wiped out millions of people all over. Actually, just in Europe, all over Eurasia, was a terrifying thing. Plus the war, the devastations, the invasions, the cities have declined. So Gregory, that is the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, realizes that if he wants to have a shot in this complex reality that the Italian peninsula has become, he has to start looking at the rural communities and starting to talk to them with their own language, with their own mentality. The dialogi are exceptional in this sense, and the episode of Saint Aquitsius is also fascinating. If you look at that video, you understand what we're talking about, because it's not talking to the highly refined and albeit dying senatorial, late antique educated elites of now, in fact, declining cities, where at least cities that have been dramatically reduced in their power. Also, probably the Roman aristocracy was wiped out by the war, so there were few points of reference. Now he talks to a language that is the one of the people, right? With a simpler Latin. Here there are different, registers. It's a very important linguistical work. There is an enormous effort and a genius in understanding this, because normally the senatorials had been the most reactionary, the ones that didn't want to give up anything about their own education, their own identity, and so on. Instead, Gregory, that comes from them, realizes that if they wanted to have a shot in the new world that had formed itself in spite of everything they could do about it, they had to lower themselves in a way, or at least to connect themselves with the world of the countryside, that the average Roman senator, what is a peasant or a colonist, right? They didn't even see them. They just worked for them and made them what they were in terms of wealth, of lifestyle. But what are those colonists? It's a Weltanschauung that was normal at the time, right? Even also the Romano-Germanic elites were basically the same, right? They could be more or less Romanized in a way, but practically speaking, so throughout the centuries, what will rise with vassalic beneficiary system is that noblemen are noblemen. The rest of the people are garbage, if they are considered as people, first of all. And Gregory, in the dialogy, tells the story of this long series of miracles carried out by the Italic Holy Fathers, many of which are accomplished according to modalities that correspond in a perfect way to the famous laws of magic described by the anthropologist James Frazer, according to which something produces its own similar, right? So-called homeopathic magic. So what's the point? That in order to make a person believe in something, you have to explain it or to prove it to you through the same mental categories that person is habituated to reason like. And don't think that we live in a world where we can't see that, right? Sometimes you talk with people that come from other sides of the world, and you realize you start having even within the same West, objectively, there are certain realities that are, culturally dramatically different, right? Certain values, system of values, beliefs, attitudes, background, which, it happens to talk with people. You say, but, something that you even pretend from your side is nice. Turns out that person is, first of all, they don't even understand it, right? They don't understand why you're saying that, or they think maybe it's distasteful, or they even disagree with the value that you attach to that. So this happens actually even with your neighbor. But this is an example not to underestimate the deep divides, especially in dramatically undereducated contexts like these ones, right? Think about what, late 6th century Italian countryside could be. Right? Have you ever thought, the interesting thing is that, historically speaking, we have no idea of what this reality was. That's why, in fact, works like, the geographical works are some of the single most important pillars of historical, anthropological, social, and cultural understanding of early medieval Europe, because these works of conversion were written with the same mental categories of those people we eventually in the later centuries would know absolutely nothing about, because this is the moment in which the elites lowered themselves at the level of these people to eventually regrow at a moment in which we know nothing about the lowest strata of the population. Have you ever thought what concretely 6th century Ireland could be like? It must have been amazing. But do you think we can understand or try to properly objectivize the mental categories of these people? No, we can't. We will never make it, right? Nobody knows. But we can read at this stuff and realizing, wait a second. But this is concretely, however, what they, maybe not necessarily believe, but fundamentally accepted as valid, as, plausible. Let's put it in this way. And just to come back on Gregory's theology for a moment, we see, just to make an example, to this almost ritual steadiness, right? Almost in a fixated way that is quite suspicious in this result, to the multiplication from the side of the holy men of substances that already existed at the time, like grain, oil, wine, right? Of which it's absolutely placed a small quantity in the containers, let's say, that needed to be filled, right? There is this idea that in this devastated world where people didn't even have, the material poverty of early medieval Europe is incredible, right? And these people sometimes could starve to death just because they didn't have enough material to build agricultural tools. So, for example, where one of these things breaks, all the peasant community is desperate, and it goes to the saint, and this geography says, "Oh, what?" And he fixes that, right? You think a saint will, with a snap would make all of this, would make 50 of them, but what he does is fixes that, right? Like a normal craftsman. But for these people, it's miraculous, right? He also is able to produce a tiny drop of oil or wine, or just produce a grain more, so that the peasant would survive day after day, believing, because the whole discriminant is the true belief. Or sometimes, and this is even more interesting, that it becomes a collective thing and properly a magical one, that is the single saint, right? Even when he founded the monastery and there are other monks with them, the other monks do not believe and despair and think we will die all. Instead, the saint says, you're unfaithful, to not give up, and he makes the thing done. He prays, he sacrifices himself and allows the others to have enough to survive, right? And this is also the leading role, naturally, that the monastery assumes for the rural communities, right? These monasteries in the early medieval Europe, you have to think, they were huts, right? There was an extreme poverty, but it was just about the figure of the guy that made the magic, right? And we're talking about context could easily be pagan, because in the pagan world it was exactly the same. People believed that it was the guy who made magic and that it could get stopped from, and everybody believed it was cool. It was fine. It was a gluing factor, properly a religious factor. And this is what Christian geography starts doing. These Christian saints transform themselves into the pagan wizards. That's it. And doing something so apparently banal, to, Jesus had multiplied enormous amounts of, of bread and fish. These guys, just the tiny bit so that the guy could survive. And there is a deep moralistic thing in here, because that's what a true Christian should live with. Not to ask too much, but all what it takes to survive. For the rest, not to be distracted and to always think about Christ and believe and so on. But the socio-economical context is exactly the same. And there is, in fact, an episode that is completely similar to the magical duel sustained by Patrick, in which the magician Basilius, actually, which is, by the way, slightly, just an Eastern-sounding name for Italian standards, while this guy was trying to harm, Basilius was trying to harm the Italic monk Equitius, which was a typical, instead, Latin Italic name. So there is also this idea of the extraneity, who is Basilius? It could be actually the Byzantines, right? Just think about this term, because the papacy in here was like the tip of the balance between Lombard Italy, that is a Romano-Germanic, and the Byzantine Empire, that at this point is Romano-Hellenic in a way, and the Italians didn't like at all the Byzantines anymore. Like they had sided with the Ostrogoths during the war, because all the colonists didn't want to come back within that empire that, after all, was based just on latifundia and large estates, with all them being, colonists. And instead they transitioned, sometimes fleeing exactly from Byzantine territory to the Lombard one, where there was almost very low taxation, and where they could be in a while juridically free, and according to the Germanic model. These are all geographical strategies to knock at the door of the average Italic peasant, saying, look here, we have something new for you, and it speaks your language, right? In the episode, what Basilius does to Equitius is that he lifts up in the air his own cell, right? This is similar to Patrick's thing, right? Except it's the monk. It's the pagan magician that does the thing, which is, however, identical to the Christian one in the sense that we've seen in Patrick. So here you see the parallelism between the two things. But Equitius remains, fortunately, unharmed, and manages to drive away the arrival from the community. So here the guy who is different, the guy that doesn't believe, the guy that doesn't care about agricultural stuff and the local community and doesn't contribute to it and does dangerous stuff is expelled, right? That is to say, we're starving to death. We don't have time for evil games. Let's concentrate on something that also works for real. Because as we've seen, these miracles are, some are consistent from the Christian side, but some of them are very, very contained, very humble. So this geography presented, after all, a realistic, pragmatic, intelligent take on the logics of the local community that was concerned mostly about, working the land. That was it. There was nothing else to do practically. And it's, if you want, also an almost isolationistic or defensivistic attitude. That is, this obviously stems from a society that is hurt, right? That doesn't want to know anything about war, about politics, about all this stuff that had destroyed all what they knew and that had brought them in this dramatic misery. Right? This is the idea of the retirement, after all. It's proper of the Benedictine rule. Saint Benedict is exactly from the same context here. And that says, let's concentrate on what we can do day after day with our forces, and not just praying, but working. Ora et labor. That's a terrific propaganda. It's perfect, right? It's the perfect slogan. It was an incredible political and ecclesiastical success. Europe will become Benedictine, right? Up to the 11th century, all the monks are Benedictine from everywhere, right? In Western Europe, from north to south, it's all Benedictine. Have you wondered why this went with all this great homogeneity, and Saint Benedict is in fact the patron of Europe? Because of this very thing. And the Celts contributed dramatically to this, as we've seen. So from Italy to Ireland, we are in a world in which magic is a reality with which you have to cope with, right? If the Saint Gregory, at least in appearance, doesn't seem to doubt, as we've seen before, of the reality of the magical arts of Basilius, but it's the same. On the other hand, Patrick, exactly because he had defeated the masters of magic, the Druids, had opened the way to the conversion of Ireland. Of course, as St. Patrick's Day is enough popularized thanks to the United States, especially, to know what's the meaning of the Irish tradition and what it does celebrate. So much that this formula began to bear this extraordinary fruits exactly from this very century. Right? It was a slow process, but it probably began to consolidate from the very beginning. That's the homogeneity of it. And it will be the Irish monks, in fact, to carry out, principally at least, the evangelization of Britain. But of course, as we've seen, there were already some Christians. Consider, of course, that Patrick was born in Roman Britain, right? So here also the Gaelic world actually is influenced, they are one in front of the other, come on. And of course also from Ireland there is an important Gaelicization of certain areas of Britain proper. During this time, think about St. Columba, think about Iona, think about the Scots, think about all the various exchanges that existed in this reality. And Irish monks that, however, and partly more famously, we could say, will reverse themselves on the continent, playing also a decisive role in the copying and preservation of the old texts that for them constituted the indispensable vehicle in order to enter within the world of the Holy Scriptures and written in Latin. This was also another problem. contexts that didn't know literacy, right? And especially not in the way it had existed in the Roman Empire. Think about all the problems of transforming, putting to Latin alphabet Anglo-Saxon phonetics, right? And that's also why today's English has so many exceptions, because that was all a work that these people had to work together for finding a solution to. But this doesn't mean, however, that the Irish acculturation happened in a way only, right? In a direction only. On the contrary, because the Celtic Christianities, let's say the plural, that were present in Ireland and in the Celtic fringe of Britain, Scotland, Wales, you know what we mean, had always particular characteristics. An ecclesiastical structure on a monastic base, as we were saying before, framed by bishops/abbots that corresponded to the Irish social structure, that, as we've seen, was devoid of cities on which to hinge to structure the diocese according to the late antique Mediterranean model. And also a specific spirituality. The most evident manifestations of which are the concept of peregrinatio and the penitentials, which we will take a look to now. So the peregrinatio, as the name says, of course, is this penitential practice tied to the journey, to the travel, right? That is physical, for sure, but it is aimed properly towards the objective of an internal purification. I would say, if anything, for geographical reasons, the British Isles had this problem, because we know that of reaching Rome, right, as they were more distant than other areas of Europe, so we know, also the Anglo-Saxon kings, what they did, they were old, they felt close to the end. What they do is they go to Rome, long journey, they arrive to Rome, they make a donation, and then they die, right? Famously enough, today's city of Rome also maintains this toponyms. There were large communities of Anglo-Saxons in Rome, of Britons in general, right? That were all these pilgrims that came from so far away. Then eventually, as Christianity will enlarge, there will be naturally a lot of Scandinavian people from Iceland, right? That made all the way through to this pilgrimage, because that's what the peregrinatio is. That was also, probably also tied to the dynamics of this non-urbanized realities for which the world, nature, its relation with it. You can think even things like the climate can influence the division of a people. They think about this northern winters, right? There is if you read the Venerable, you read this, the Flight the Sparrow, right? The part of the Sparrow where the king but the Thanes is dining in the hall, and outside the storm, the darkness, and the sparrow enters from one window, then passes through the hall and exits from the others. And Bate says, to me, king, life is a bit like the flight of the sparrow. We don't know where we come from. We pass through this journey of life, and then we go back into the darkness, and we do not know. So this fatalism, in part, but this vision of the world, that this is deep, and surely insular Christianity contributed a lot to this sensitivity, even to this poetry, right? Literally speaking, of course, which is different from a Gregory of Tours or even a Gregory the Great or Isidore of Seville, and so on. Despite we're all Christians. And obviously, this peregrinatio was aimed to the objective of an interior purification, as we've said, And it was directed sometimes, and this goes in line at least with the broader Western monasticism at this time, towards the wildest and inaccessible places, such as the remote islands of the north of Britain, right? Searching for solitude, right? This is typical of Western monasticism specifically, because monasticism was never fully detached from the world, right? Since the fathers of the desert in the East, but objectively, in Latin Germanic Europe and in Celtic Europe, in this sense, you find a different world, right? After all, the East, Egypt, Palestine, where the Syria, where the early monasticism has spread. Yeah, it had solitudes, but civilizations was fairly near. It was a hell of a civilization. Figured out what the British Isles could be in the 6th or the 7th century, right? We're talking about there is a real, I mean, even spiritually speaking, there is a real isolation, because you live within the paganism of a culture that has never seen something similar. Whereas, if you speak of the Hellenistic East, they might have not seen Christianity up to a certain point, but they knew something, that there was something pretty similar to it, because it was full of similar religions and philosophies to the same message of it. This world was truly, culturally, geographically, something distant, right? And generally speaking, Western monasticism is very much more directed even to the wild side of the story, simply because Western Europe was overall less urbanized than the Eastern Mediterranean. Let's put it in this way. And it's typical of these monasteries, naturally in places like Gaul or Italy, they weren't literally detached from the world, because the monk has to also to work as an example to the rest of the community. So as we have seen also in Saint Aquinas, they live within the community. They become a point of reference. Insular monasticism is probably the one that is most isolated, most spiritual, most and harshest, actually, because the monastic rules of the early movement especially were nothing less than a physical torture. And I'm not kidding, right? This was stated multiple times. And let's not even think about medieval monasticism as a, just like you go on vacations at a monastery, just eat and read, and after all, you're fine. No, these were actually pretty gloomy, were not dark, in many sense, realities. The world was what it was, in the sense that it was terrifying, abusive, violent, and the morality, right, the moral standards, the physical deprivations, I think here could be astonishing. And in fact, we know, because the same monks sometimes actually refuted to do this. And there is this side of the harshest side of the story that you don't find as so much as in the rest of Western Europe, after all, that is more balanced at some levels. But even that wasn't such a comfortable experience. But the peregrinatio could be at least aimed towards a practical direction, such as the foundation of monasteries that became spreading centers of Christianity. And relatively to this, there is the exemplary work of the Irish Columba, right? Active between the 6th and the 7th century in Gaul, where he famously founded the monasteries of Luxeuil, Annegret, and Fontenay, and in northern Italy, where he founded the monastery of Bobbio, right? Now, these two areas are interesting, by the way, because they had kind of a church on their own. In part, the Frankish church had its own character, idea, also almost political, institutional ideology of kingship and so on. the Longobards mostly gravitated around the authority of the Milanese church, that historically, since the late antiquity, had its own specific character, just like the one of Ravenna and the one of Rome, and this time considered that Rome was already the preeminent center of, not just, of probably from a cultural point of view, that there was no doubt that Rome was the most important center of Western Christianity, but still, formally speaking, there was not the concept of primacy, not from a charismatic point of view, right? So the idea was that theoretically still all the bishops were alike. They all had the same authority. Even the archbishops, because technically those were just the administrators of larger districts, but provinces properly, but it's not that they were intrinsically less of other bishops, at least, but then the same hierarchy produced the segmentation, of course. And this was all very important because the Irish missions were very important, for example, for the Franks to convert those areas that at this point were still loosely Christianized, to say the least, right? And where paganism still survived in wide numbers under the namely Christian Frankish kingdom. The Longobards at this time were still pagan, and Columba would be notoriously for the patronage received by the Longobards through their queen Theodolinda, that was Catholic, right? As the Longobards were Arian, but she had married the Longobard king Authari. She was from Bavaria, by the way. Authari was still an Arian. Then she married Agilulf, and Agilulf was the one that granted Columba to found Bobbio, for example. And he remained Arian, seemingly. We were not sure if he converted to Catholicism, but he had his son with his wife Theodolinda baptized according to the Catholic rite. So the Theodolinda is a beautiful figure. She had this correspondence with Gregory the Great. This is the time in which there is this intense dialogue between the Longobards in Rome, and Saint Columba catalyzed this, which also, Agilulf was an Arian king, and Allah was a Catholic to found a monastery in his own kingdom. So that also tells you how there are no persecutions of sort documented in Longobard Italy against the Catholic clergy, right? That tells you how political and non-religious such stands were. And the Longobards were to convert dramatically. The Franks were already Catholic. They skipped the problem. Thanks to Clovis that had understood it. Soon they passed from paganism directly to Catholicism. The Longobards took a while, but there was no clash because of it. Contrariwise to what is commonly believed, these terrible, intransigent Arians. It's not true, right? It's most of a conflictual relation with the papacy for strictly political, military reasons, not because of whatever they believed. And conception and practice of the peregrinatio will mark gradually the entire experience of medieval Christianity. Think about the crusade pilgrimage, the armed pilgrimage of the crusade, to say better, and contributing to render it unmistakably different from the late antique one, and in some ways, probably in a Western European sense, different from also the Byzantine one, right? And this is all thanks, as we have seen, to this Irish cultural background, Gaelic cultural background, broadly meant. Relatively to the other manifestation, the penitentials, these are fruit of the application of the penitence discipline with literally a list of penalties that were measured according to a logic that was the same one of the Celtic customary law that had at its own base the principle of, say, composability of the fault of the crime according to a payment, which is typically pagan contractualism. And in the penitential books starting from the 6th century were thus written down very meticulous lists of sins cited by the relative penalties. Right? It's that simple, because both in the Germanic and in the Celtic world, it was that simple. You killed a person, okay, you have to pay this amount of money, right? You steal a cow, well, you have to pay this amount of money. You can't, I will kill you, but if you can't pay, I don't. It was that simple. So it was that logic and crude and simple, though, and functional, so that it was transmitted from the Celtic culture that was devoid in this sense of any scruple, Christianly speaking, into the penalties for the Christian sins. And this is fascinating, because this is exactly from what that rigidity that we were talking about before came from. Because this sins, there was no mercy. You committed this sin, okay, you fast for an entire year. Right? We have these things, for example, that that are brutal, right? We're talking about fasting, also sexual abstinence, because this was aimed at disciplining the community, not just the monks, the whole community of Christians. And so the new converts that had never heard of it and didn't have many other ways of addressing this, even these impositions, right? And they're very harsh. For example, the imposition to go around disarmed, which for a Gaelic freeman is not really one of the most common habit, really. This was imposed. There were also offers to the church were imposed in money properly. Also the exclusion from the communion with the other faithful, as in other contexts. So you understand already from this that there is a communitarian value too, which also the aristocracies would profit from, given that these were mostly now the guys that were allowing these monks to settle all over Ireland. Why? Because if you start imposing the people to be disarmed, you can control them better, and you can pacify the situation. You can extend your power. You can create a more functional government, right? Which in here, right, was never been seen. So it started very gradually. These were attempts. They didn't work immediately. And the penalties, as we were saying, could be very harsh. The fasting could happen for a year, as we were saying, and this was not even the worst, because in the harshest of the cases, during the whole fasting, you could be imposed a regime, a diet made exclusively of bread and water. Just think of what it means, right? Or in a word, of course, people didn't eat much in the first place, but if you take them away, maybe there's a few proteins that they used to it, it's much worse, and it's freaking cold out there, right? So that's a big demand, right? Cold baths, right? Think about living in a world without heating system, and in the north of Europe in winter, and being asked to regularly bath with cold water. This is exactly the practice that was routinely demanded, and that the monks rebelled against, right? All the rest was fine, but bathing in cold water, and actually I think they're pretty right in some way. So, but however, relatively to the conception of the first Christianity that contemplated the confession as public and solemn act, it's evident that we're finding ourselves in front of a greater adaptation of the cultural characteristics of the neophytes both Celtic or Germanic, as we've seen in the either in Britain, of course, or in the continent, and the fact that the Germanic law was based on similar principles as the Celtic one, and this favored the spread of these norms among the Germans within and outside the former Roman borders. Right? This is particularly important. It was probably this disciplining function that the Gaelic missionaries achieved, right, in gluing Europe together on the base of these practices as well. So the success of the penitential books of Gaelic tradition was such that many were written for many centuries to come. And in spite of the reserves advanced by many scholars, let's say, that are somewhat similar to those proposed also about the homiletic literature, for example, that ask us, let's say, to question the source of particular caution. We can state that such books, however, represent an extraordinary source for the historian, as we have seen, because they do not even represent reality. So those scholars are right. We know also historically speaking, Ireland had a very slow improvement after all. The Viking era gave an important boost. Also the Anglo-Norman conquest, but the Celtic fringe, also militarily speaking, remains very conservative up to we have evidence of Highlanders fighting in medieval fashion up to the end of the 17th century. And that is not to say that they didn't know how to use a firearm. They would, right? But these were wars that objectively didn't change much over time. This is kind of it's even more interesting because it makes you understand that even the harshness of this imposition was to cope with a world that was a very hard nut to crack. So, but they show us anyway exactly what they were trying to fix, and that seemed to be the most important aspects, right? We're talking about social, or therefore collective or individual behaviors that often highlight wide areas, by the way, because they were very pervasive. They contemplated many aspects. They were very, not just very harsh, but very detailed in this sense, that highlight these areas that otherwise we would have not known anything about, especially in these areas of Europe. First and foremost, the one of sexual and matrimonial life. All right. Okay, so we can stop here for today. There is, said enough. And we will have to come back a lot on Irish monasticism and, generally speaking, the contribution of it to the conversion of Europe. Because, as you know, they were some of the single most, but they were called on purpose by the Carolingians, by the Merovingians as well. We've seen even the connection with the Longobards. So creating this axis that will be also historically one of the most important of Europe. Think about the Via Francigena, right? And this axis that goes from Britain to from the Channel up across France straight to Rome, right? It was also overwhelmingly the most important Christians. I mean, we know even from mission, they mostly from Rome. Eventually, they went to the south and embarked from the Holy Land. But we know from these missionaries, especially though from these pilgrims that sometimes arrived from faraway places like Iceland, that everybody was amazed by Rome, right? Eventually, they start telling all the things that was there, the monuments and stuff. They arrive to Jerusalem and say, okay, well, yeah, we arrived to Jerusalem, we've seen here here and there where our Lord was, but it's not a big deal, right? Rome was the pole here, was the the area from which, and we'll see it better in other chances, but everything was managed, everything was administered, and this wall conversion was guided from, right? Especially the ones of the most, in fact, Romanized, Christianly speaking, areas of Europe. But probably at this range of, the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons was one of the greatest successes in early medieval Europe, ecclesiologically speaking. And the other great axis, naturally, was the one from France to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, northwestern Spain. But that's another axis that was also the one for the Reconquista, all the Frankish knights that also arrived to northern Spain to fight against the Muslims and so on. But anyhow, for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.